Sometimes events happen in life that force a person to radically change his worldview. This happened to me as well. My name is Eugene. I'm 34 years old, but my head is already decorated with strands of gray hair. And all because just 2 years ago I was faced with something that I didn't even know existed. All my life I have been a staunch atheist and everything connected with mysticism has always passed by in my ears. Perhaps this is partly due to the fact that I lost both of my parents as a child. They were not saved by any prayers and requests to the Lord. Literally by the age of 25, I achieved some success in my work and decided to purchase a private house. A suitable house was found not far from the city in a cozy village. I was specifically looking for a small village, because I wanted to live in a calm environment away from the bustle of the city. The transaction went quickly and I became the proud owner of a cozy house in which I lived a happy 7 years of my life. One morning, waking up from the noise of construction equipment, I looked out the window and saw a bulldozer that was clearing a neighbor's plot. By the way, I had good relations with the locals, and I myself considered myself a local. So I was extremely surprised why the neighbors on the site were doing God knows what. In the meantime, a drilling rig drove into the site and began to bite into the ground. As it turned out, my neighbors decided to drill their own well so as not to pay for water. When the work was completed, I visited a neighbor with a little white bottle in order to find out how much he had drilled water and, so to speak, take the first samples. We had a glass or two and went to the well, in the place of which there was now a freshly installed well. Near the well, in heaps of dug-up earth, something turned white. Looking closely, I realized that these were someone's bones that the drilling rig had dug out of the ground. My neighbor reassured me by explaining that these were the bones of a cow, because once in Soviet times there was a farm here. I've calmed down. While talking and drinking, we did not notice how the hands of the clock approached midnight and, recollecting myself, I went home. In the morning, my head was cracking terribly, and when I went out onto the porch, I noticed some kind of meeting near the gate of a neighbor's house. As it turned out, at night the neighbor disappeared along with his entire family. The doors in the house were wide open. There were no signs of a struggle, as if they themselves got up and went to no one knows where. Since that day, the quiet life in our village has ended. The neighbor and his family did not return for dinner or the next day, and his well was immediately privatized by the locals, who with great joy drew water from it. And the particularly enterprising even managed to bring water from the well to their site. On the morning of the next day, it turned out that another family was missing. The circumstances were the same. The family was prosperous and again disappeared without a trace. The locals began to sound the alarm. There were suspicions that a maniac or even a whole organized crime group of cannibals was operating in the district. Adults stopped letting their children out after sunset, and they themselves tried not to leave their houses. However, this did not stop the series of disappearances, and the district police officer only shrugged, saying, "Well, what can I do?" On the morning of the next day, horror went through the village, quietly covering every house and creeping into the soul of each of its inhabitants. In one night, 4 houses were empty at once in different parts of the village. People began to massively barricade and fortify the houses, and those who had weapons set up firing points. The village went into a state of siege. As for the poor district policeman, he was almost quartered. He hid behind the fact that he was waiting for approval to initiate a criminal case from the regional center, saying that there was no corpus delicti. Although the people are not particularly reassured. Days passed, but no matter what measures we took, in the morning it turned out that another house was empty again during the night, and sometimes more than one. By the end of the month, only 3 houses remained in the village, one of which was mine. Communications and cable internet disappeared. There was also no transport connection with the city. And so, on another day, when the sun sank to the horizon, and the night gradually entered into its legal rites, plunging the almost empty village into darkness, Somewhere on the outskirts of the settlement there was a man's cry and a shot from a hunting rifle. A second and everything was quiet. I assumed that, most likely, another house would be empty in the morning, when suddenly, somewhere behind the fence of my side, there was a crunch of branches. I hid, closing the shutters, and climbed up to the attic, dragging the ladder behind me. Through a small attic window, I could see my whole area at a glance. Surrey loading a gun borrowed from one of the deserted houses, I began to observe. The crunch of branches was replaced by the sound of footsteps on the rubble in front of the house, and so on for about 2 hours. Then, through the gate, a hand was thrown and reached for the bolt. The metal pin fell to the ground, and the gate swung open. A male figure entered the precinct, and to my horror, I recognized it. In the light of the moon, on my lawn stood a neighbor, the one who disappeared first. It just looked kind of weird. The skin is very pale, covered in some kind of dirt. The eyes sparkle like two LEDs. Yes, and in the gate there was something strange and inhuman. When the neighbor began to approach the house, I noticed that he was moving like a doll on hinges. Plastic and human tread were completely absent. Hell, he wasn't human. The neighbor approached the house, disappearing from my field of vision, when suddenly, about a minute later, the house shook from a strong blow, and something heavy fell loudly to the floor. Apparently, it was the front door, which my neighbor literally took out. Footsteps and hoarse breathing sounded from below. This something was looking for me. It ransacked the house, kicked out the doors, but still could not find me. The time was approaching dawn, when the creature finally remembered the attic, and apparently, not finding a ladder, decided to climb the wall, but as soon as the first rays of the morning sun looked out from the horizon, the creature instantly left the house and literally evaporated. It was not until dinner time that I dared to get down from my hiding place and looked around the yard with the barrel. A little bolder, I went through the village, hoping to find survivors. However, after wandering for about 3 hours, I realized that I was left alone. Yes, I was the last living person in this village. You will ask why I did not leave immediately, as all this mess began? So I had nowhere to go. I have no relatives, no friends as such, so I had to stay in the village. However, then, left completely alone, I nevertheless decided to leave the village. Having loaded everything I needed into the car, I noticed a puddle that had spread under it. Looking under the car, I was dumbfounded. The brake lines were cut off, and the engine sump was literally split in half, as if it had been hit with a hammer. I went through the village looking for another getaway car. This was followed by the whole day, as a result of which I found an old motorcycle which I tried to start, but apparently it had problems with the carburetor, so after dragging it to my side, I started setting it up, and then covered the equipment with a rag till the motorcycle did not catch the eye and climbed into the attic again, for the day was already drawing to a close. They appeared quietly as soon as the time passed 10 p.m. Gradually, I began to notice the figures that walked around my site. Every minute there were more and more of them, and when I looked at the faces in more detail, I realized that they were all my missing neighbors. All the villagers looked equally pale, and they were all standing in my lot. Among them was a district police officer with several policemen. Apparently, this was the operational group, which simply did not reach our village. A strange procession stood in the courtyard until midnight. No one made a sound and no one twitched, as if these wax figures occupied my entire area. But as soon as the clock struck 12, real hell began to happen on the site. All the figures simultaneously began to move, rushing towards the house. The whole house was shaking. Something was constantly cracking and breaking. Through the attic window, I saw the creatures rush to the cellar, which stood in the distance. Again there was a crash and I noticed how one of the creatures, without making any effort, pulled out the door to the cellar along with the jam. Fear began to slowly shackle my body, although I hoped that the creatures would forget about my existence and simply leave. But then something happened that caused my soul to almost leave my body. There was a bang on the hatch to the attic, causing her to jump and fall back with a crash. Damn, the creatures did find my hiding place, I realized in horror. One after another, heavy blows fell on the hatch cover. Apparently, the creatures have created something like a living staircase. And then, at one moment, the lid bounced again and this time flew sideways. And from below came the vile whisper of dozens of voices. You disturbed us. You drank from our graves. You will pay for this. At that moment, I was completely confused and believed that I was going crazy. All this went to some kind of mystical insanity. But now, a pale hand grabbed the edge of the hole. The boards cracked and I realized that it was no longer possible to interfere. I had to run. Swinging, I hit the window with the butt of my gun with all my strength, from which it crumbled into the street. After the second blow the frame also flew out. Preparing to jump, I turned around and saw several silhouettes that had already almost climbed into the attic. There was no more delay. I jumped down, since the height was small, so I didn't hurt anything. The gun fell a meter away from me, and as soon as I picked it up, one of my neighbors ran out at me from the side of the basement, or rather, something reminiscent of him. The shot in his head shattered, turning into a bloody mess. I ran with all my might to the hidden motorcycle, throwing the double-barreled shotgun to the side. Behind him came the clatter of many feet and a vile hissing whisper. Jumping on the bike, I tried to start it with a kickstart, praying that the engine would not fail, and to my happiness, I heard the rhythmic rumble of a two-stroke engine. There was no time to warm up the engine, and having stuck the first gear, I twisted the throttle and the motorcycle briskly rushed forward. Jumping out of the yard, I began to pick up speed, but the vile whisper still did not go away. Looking around, I almost gave my soul to God. The creatures that had once been my neighbors were now rushing after a motorcycle flying at full speed on their own legs, and not really lagging behind. A turn appeared ahead, and I had to slow down a bit, and at that moment, one of the creatures, taking advantage of the situation, jumped and grabbed the red-hot muffler, but it seemed to me that it did not feel pain, and the muffler only went through under the powerful grip of the creature. However, the turn ended, and once again opening the gas, I dropped the pursuer from the tail. I do not remember how I got to the city, and how I looked for the way to the police. As the officer on duty later told me, a traffic police crew caught up with me winding through the streets of the night city and took me to the police station. I came to my senses only after a glass of cognac, which one of the inspectors kindly poured for me. As soon as I told them everything that happened to me, even experienced employees began to doubt and almost called a psychiatric hospital. But apparently, there was still something in my story that could convince them, and after making a request to the Paradise Department, the elderly policeman thoughtfully said that the group sent to my village had indeed not been in touch for several days. The police contacted the leadership and explained the situation. The command was immediately given to collect personnel, and it was ordered to send an opera group with powerful fire support to my village. I was asked to be present as a witness. It took the police about 3 hours to get ready and agree, and so, at about 5 in the morning we arrived in the village. At first glance, it was completely empty, and having stopped the cars on the outskirts, the police began to comb the whole village in a chain. An hour later, I was invited to a conversation with the head of the group, during which he told me that all my fellow villagers were in their homes, but had been dead for several days. The corpses were in a variety of poses, as if they all died in an instant. However, there was still one significant oddity. Many of the prematurely deceased had fresh earth on their feet, as if they were still walking down the street just 20 minutes ago. The village was cordoned off, and no one had a logical explanation for what happened. As it turned out later, bones were found near the very well that my neighbor had dug, exactly those that the neighbor identified as animal bones. As a result, they turned out to be human, and judging by their age, they were very many years old. The leader of the group, who turned out to be a native Siberian, took me aside and said quietly, "I know what I'm talking about. In my homeland, it is customary to honor the memory of ancestors. Your neighbor disturbed the ancient burial place, and your whole village began to drink water from the graves, for which they paid the price. The dead don't like being disturbed by the living. Many months have passed from the moment I encountered something not from our world. But since then I began to believe in mysticism and in God and in the devil. Of course, I changed my place of residence. I moved to a high-rise building in the city. But I'm still afraid one day to see on the street the pale faces and burning eyes of people passing by.